Well, welcome to our conversation here. I think one that's very timely and important to have about getting bias out of our systems. I'm going to ask my panel members here to give name, rank, serial number, short introduction of what they do. Let's start on that.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlotte Flanagan. I lead our diversity inclusion efforts at DocuSign.
Hi, good morning. I'm Amy Lou Abernethy, and AMP Creative is my company. I'm the president and chief learning strategist. We create learning experiences for enterprise companies, including D&I learning ecosystems, a lot of it using innovative technology. You'll see our VR experience outside in the lobby.
Quite sensational. I think a lot of people want to try that.
Yeah, I want you to try it.
I want to try it too. For any particular reason? No,
because I want your feedback. I think you're a smart guy.
Good, thank you. Good morning. I'm Javier Barrientos. I lead the diversity and inclusion engagement team for T-Mobile out of Bellevue, Washington. It's our headquarters. That title might change because we're considering a renaming of our team. So come back next year. We'll let you know what the new title is. A pleasure to be here with you this morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shinder Dhillon, and I work for Fortive, and I lead inclusion and diversity at the company. And it's a brand new role, and I've been there for about 15 months.
I'm Enrique Cerna, and I'm your moderator. I'm trying to be sort of retired person here in Seattle. I'm still kind of keeping my nose into things. Just, nosy journalist. Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Well, let's start with this. And this is actually something that Shinder brought up when we were having a conversation earlier. The responsibility of inclusion. Whose responsibility? Who owns it? Or does anybody own it?
Yeah, so we had an interesting conversation as we were preparing for this panel. And
they like to talk, by the way.
We do actually, and we like to debate.
Yeah,
it was a very healthy discussion and challenge each other. And so, from my perspective, everyone owns inclusion. So, part of our strategy at Fortive, that is one of our strategic pillars. And I know we had discussions around, should it be senior leaders, should it be managers? And I know in the 2 decades I've been doing this work, that's one of the things that I think there isn't a silver bullet. And where I've seen the most impact is every single individual has to take some level of ownership. For leaders, sure, there's a certain level of responsibility because the role that they have. But I think there's about 300 people in this audience today. If every single one of us was just to do one thing, just think about the impact that would make. And it goes beyond allyship, because I know that's the current buzzword, and everybody is getting into allyship, and I think that's absolutely important and key. But this is, what are you as an individual going to do? It's not just about speaking up. It's not just about being an advocate, but it's also about what kind of different decisions am I going to make? And when you're sitting in a company and you're doing some succession planning, or you see somebody, make a certain comment, then how are you going to interject or speak up for that person? Or make a decision to say, okay, I'm now going to choose to do something different. So for me, it's really about everyone owns inclusion.
May I jump in for a
second?
No, sorry.
Shinder?
All right, I lost control already.
So, I'm being the contrarian that I am, as
That's
you know.
right, yes.
So I think I want to add one more owner to your list, besides the leaders and everyone, is the system that owns diversity and inclusion as well.
And what do you mean by that?
So, every country, every company, every society has systems, and a lot of these barriers to equity and inclusion get codified and hardened into policies, practices, laws, even physical structures, imagery, software. All these places are places where we typically tend to ignore, and I think the conversation around diversity and inclusion is over-indexed into the behavioral model of diversity and inclusion. And that is good, but it has limits. So there's so much that we can do as individuals to de-bias ourselves, and still change will not come. The analogy I want to offer here is, think about the environment. You could be great environmentalists. You could recycle every day. You could have zero footprint emissions. But your individual behavior is not going to change the climate, because there are forces at work that do not depend of the interaction that you and I have. And so these are so you and I being great environmentalists or great inclusionists, as I would call it, is not necessarily going to change the system. So we cannot keep our eyes off those policies, practices, structures that continue to drive inequity and exclusion in the companies that we are and the society that we're in.
Yes, I agree. And you are both right. You are both right, because I want to give like a really granular example for bias in the system. There's a piece of hardware out there that I'm intimately familiar with. It's a VR headset. And that piece of hardware has bias programmed into it the way it's designed. If you have difficulty hearing, if you have difficulty moving your head or your hand, if you have difficulty wearing something on your head, I mean, there are so many people for whom that experience, that virtual reality experience, it isn't something that they can participate in. And as this technology becomes a more important part, a way to access more important things like a laptop or a smartphone, that's going to keep people, that's a barrier to entry. Mm-hmm. So, but it's people who designed it without thinking about it, young, enthusiastic, mostly men who designed it. And it's people who are figuring out how to create inclusive practices around it. So I belong to a council called XRI, the XR Inclusion Council, and we are working with larger enterprise companies to come up with inclusive design principles. Mm-hmm. So there is bias in the system, no doubt about it. But the system won't solve itself. Right. It takes people coming together, not just individuals, but systems of people coming together to overcome those. And I think that you're both right. And it's that tandem work that needs to be done.
Yeah, it's definitely a both and solution. The only point I'm trying to make is that usually the system part is ignored. And then the burden of fixing the situation gets put into the interpersonal relationship. And a lot of people go to unconscious bias training, and we spend billions of dollars in that when we have, the opportunities really staring at our face where we could really make significant change.
Yeah. How many of you are in an HR role? Raise your hand. Vast majority, yeah. So if you think about inclusion in the employee life cycle and all the different touch points that each one of you are probably involved in some way, shape, or form, if we start to think about, yes, everyone owns inclusion, in my mind, leadership has a bigger influence on the impact they can make to drive inclusion. But if you think about all the different touch points that all of you are involved in or engaged in the HR organization at your companies, there are different ways to infuse inclusion into every single aspect of that. So whether it's leadership training and development, whether it's recruiting, whether you're an HRBP, you have an opportunity as an individual to also influence inclusion and how employees experience that. Yeah. Because as D&I practitioners, most of the time, we do not own the things that we're trying to change. And so for us, it's really, really important that we partner with our leaders and with others in the HR organization to make sure that that we enable them to be able to think about inclusion first when they're designing their systems, when they're designing their policies, when we're designing leadership training and development, for example. So that's really key.
Let's talk about leadership and leaders. Yeah. And you say everyone kind of owns this, but it seems that your leaders at the top better be the ones that will be out in front of this. But are they?
Yeah. So can I just add something? So first of all, to the whole policies and practices, but it's humans that design that, right? So I think it is both, and the behavior part is for sure one of it. Mm-hmm. And I think the system piece, the integration is so huge. Yeah. It's really looking at the whole life cycle. And one of the things, a practical example I can give is, one of the things we're doing is looking at the whole talent management process and to see where we can infuse kind of moments that matter. Mm-hmm. And then to the leadership piece, and as they're sitting in those meetings, is we have a tip sheet called Breaking Bias. So when you're doing performance calibrations, when you are looking at giving feedback, when you're doing goal setting. So for all of those is to say, okay, here's a refresher, and you as leader are responsible for making sure in the first 5 minutes you are going to go through this, and then as you go through performance reviews, as you go through goal setting, because we know those unconscious biases kind of come in, especially from a systems perspective as well.
Yeah, and one thing I would love to see around this, maybe somebody here will take me on it, maybe you, leaders leave a bunch of data that could really help them be inclusive, and right? And so if you look at, if you created your own, especially senior leaders, if you created your own index of equity and inclusion as a leader, and you accounted for the people that you mentored, promoted, hired, and developed, if they all start looking like you, and sounding like you, and thinking like you, I'm going to tell you something. You can spend all the money you want on unconscious bias or in any other kinds of trainings. That record will, speak a lot more than any words that you can put out there. So rather than I would love to see like some sort of kind of a tool that allows a leader to deal with the facts of their own record of equity and inclusion.
Well, those tools exist. They're at all of our fingertips. Those metrics are at the fingertips of the HR professionals, whether or not leaders are gold and bonused against those sorts of metrics is up to the company. But Javier, wouldn't the leaders need to be aware of the systems of oppression before they begin to implement those sorts of goals? I mean, don't you think that awareness comes hand in hand with the evolution of a company's inclusive efforts?
Not necessarily.
Are you losing?
No, I'm.
Just going off at random.
It's okay.
It's a great question, but in my experience, I've seen leaders who are very biased do the right thing. And I've seen the opposite as well. Leaders who present themselves as very inclusive leaders who have done nothing to change that record that they created. So I think, what I love to do, what doesn't really exist, is an ability to kind of create this mirror that you hold up to these leaders as they rise up the ranks, to be able to see the record that they've created. So
Why can't you just pull it out of the metrics? The promotion metrics? And
it sounds simple, right? But it hasn't been done. I mean, there's a lot of HR people here. Does anybody have in their organizations a record that allows a leader to see their own track in terms of equity and inclusion in their hires, promotions, performance reviews, etc.?
Do you have those analytics?
Does anybody have a leader that part of their goals is to show
I've got some people,
their progress?
just a few.
Yeah.
Maybe next year
It's
they'll all
easier.
nod their
It's easier
heads.
to track that kind of stuff if it's okay. This person's going to be on my team, but there's so much mentoring, there's so much sponsorship that goes on where it's not going to be. I mean, you can point to data a lot, but in all honesty, like sometimes the more nuanced stuff that happens, like who are you spending your unstructured time with, who are you talking about in meetings when they're not in the room, and where do they end up, is not always going to be directly under that leader. And so I think I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of the sponsorship piece and how that plays out can look really different than just the team that they're developing underneath themselves. So it is really difficult to kind of be able to hold that mirror up just by relying on some of the data that HR has.
Gotcha.
That can be honestly a little difficult to deal with.
All right,
one
let
of
me
the
play
things that-
again here, folks. It's okay. No, it's
do
all
have
right.
one
I think it's
comment.
important to hear what you guys have to say. You're the one that's doing it.
So one thing that we are doing is before you get promoted to a senior vice president, you have to have a very diverse leadership team. If you don't, you do not get promoted, period. And so that is one way, because the question is, so here's a set of criteria that you've got to have business results, your employee engagement survey has to be at a certain percentage and above, and you have to have a diverse team.
Yeah. And Shinder,
So when we say diverse team, it's a balanced team.
Yeah.
Right?
What I love when we talked last time is that
Yeah.
you actually gave a lot of great examples of how you are beginning to change practices like this one.
Yeah.
And you also talked about performance reviews and
Yeah.
accounting for for equity and inclusion as part of performance.
Right.
Those are the ones I think that really get to help us move the needle. Have you seen a change as you implemented these practices?
Look, there's one, and I think what you might be talking about in our one of our operating companies in India. This is actually one of the opcos which has a lot of manufacturing in the organization, and the gender mix was awful. And so they did three things. One, they introduced blind resumes. And then secondly, and for a country like India, for us, especially in the US, you think the EEO statement at the end of a job description is just normal practice. And what they found was they didn't have that. And so people self-select out when you don't have that statement and you don't realize, oh my God, this means a lot. When you read it and it's missing, you make a lot of assumptions. And so that's one of the things. And then the other piece was, the three things, was gender neutral job descriptions. So those are the three things that they put in place. And what they found in a 8-month period, their gender increased by 22%. So that was huge. And so that's kind of some of the practices, and and when you talk about systems and processes, right?
Right. Exactly.
That's kind of what it gets to. But it did take courage on the hiring manager's part, because it does. Usually you don't want to rock the boat. And she asked the question, would you be willing to hire a female for this role? A couple of the hiring managers actually just outright said no. Now, they were coming from a place of concern because this is not the kind of environment, but, and they felt they were really looking out for this individual. But you've got to let that individual make up their own mind. And those are the results that we saw.
One of the things that, Amy Lou, you brought this up, you have a model that you're showing here of, it's basically using virtual reality.
Yeah, perspective taking in VR.
So give us a quick background on that, how it's working, and the impact.
So I think for some people of power and privilege, understanding the need for inclusive practices can be an intellectual practice. It can be a moral practice sometimes, but it becoming like a visceral, emotional practice, it coming from a place of visual experience is something that perspective taking in VR can accomplish. So we've used these experiences in workshops with large leadership teams. I'm talking about like 300, 400 global leaders who've come together for a summit. They go through 18 minutes of walking in the shoes of underrepresented minorities. They take off the headset and they engage in deep co-design work to attack systems of oppression that are encoded in their company's culture. So I am evangelical about it because I've seen how it works and it's really amazing. But it's a small bit. It can be, a catalyst to deeper conversation, but certainly needs to be part of a deep ecosystem of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in a company.
How does this relate to Jeremy Bayless's Empathy
Yeah,
Lab?
well,
Can you
he's
talk
done
about that?
Well, he's just done a ton of fascinating research. He's at Stanford, and he's done a lot of research about the impact of virtual reality and embodiment. So when in VR you embody that of an underrepresented minority or a different gender, and how does that impact your feelings of intent to engage in allyship, or he's come up with a mixed bag. I mean, sometimes it's really excellent news and really exciting news, but one thing that I find so fascinating is that a lot of these efforts deal with how individuals feel about themselves. Mm-hmm. So your own sense of self-worth, if you are a white guy and you don't feel great about yourself and you go into an embodiment experience as a Black woman, your sense of yourself is projected onto that person. So that could lower your desire to engage in allyship skills because you're transferring your own sense of self-worth onto someone else. If you feel great about yourself, that transfer sometimes happens. So if we're really talking about inclusion efforts, let's help everybody feel better about themselves. Let's give them naps and cookies.
Yeah, I'm going to eat a nap and a cookie after this. Charlotte, talk a little bit about, because your organization...
We're putting you to sleep.
Yes, no. your organization has used something similar to this, haven't you? You were talking about this earlier.
I found out it's pretty different. But what we're doing, for an example, is we're trying to enable some of our leaders to be able to practice some of those hard conversations. I think so often when you think about diversity and inclusion topics and issues, they're tough to talk about, and they're tough to know what to do in those moments and how to respond. And so as part of some of our leadership training for new leaders, we're using a software where they basically get to use their camera and practice tough, hard conversations with someone else on the background that's a live person, but it's like an avatar. So there's like a overlay, is that the right terminology?
Yeah, computer-generated avatar.
Kind of computer-generated avatar that actually responds to the conversation because it's a live person on the other end. So enabling leaders to have some of those opportunities to practice hard conversations, and they can actually log in when they need it. Like, so if they know they're gonna have a meeting, later that day, they can go in and practice that conversation before that meeting. So it's a really powerful way to enable people managers in ways that we didn't have before. And so we're really excited to be able to kind of broaden that.
And I love that it's a safe way to do it as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Do you consider that diversity coaching? I mean, do you consider that coaching around those issues?
Oh, it's definitely coaching because you're getting, in time, feedback on, and you just get to experience that conversation and see kind of where it could lead.
We're creating an experience where you get to practice an allyship framework of having a conversation with offering someone support to build solutions together. Our cultural norms really go against us talking about race and gender with one another openly and acknowledging systems of oppression. It's just not done. Me saying systems of oppression sounds pretty heavy duty, like I'm gonna take to the streets, but it's not. It's just, they just are there. Yeah. So practicing in a safe environment without that psychological risk, those weird conversations that just feel like it's wrong to talk about, I think is a really great opportunity. That's really cool.
I want to borrow your three minds because I have an issue too with this concept of allyship, right? And so here's the issue. When I
you have a lot of issues.
Yeah. Well, I get paid to solve these issues. Right? So
and that's why you're here.
That's what keeps me employed. So this is the thinking around this. When you think about how people engage with diversity and inclusion or with difference, you see kind of three patterns, right? So there's the person who's the supporter who maybe attends the conference, signs up for an event, receives emails, etc. This is good. So we like supporters. We love you. If you're here, we love you. There's the ally, which I think is the next step. And allies, maybe they extend a hand to diversity, to usually to a group or two that they have great affinity for. So maybe you're great with veterans or with women or LGBT, but the extent of your allyship is limited to that affinity or passion that you have for that particular group. But what I really would like to see is a next level of engagement, which I call, the inclusionist. Which it doesn't really matter which is the form of difference that is facing you. Wherever you see this inequity or this gap in inclusion, whether it's even a straight white man who's being excluded, or a Black disabled woman, you move to close that equity or inclusion gap.
Yeah, you just described Keith Edwards' model of it's the aspirational allyship model, I think is what it's called, and there are three parts. It's where you are being an ally because of one person. Like, I wouldn't want my daughter to be treated that way, so I'm gonna be good to this person and kind of save them. There's that. I'm going to be an ally to a group because it's good for them and I see how they're being oppressed. And then there's the allyship for inclusion, which is, I recognize this is good for all of us, where no matter who you are, systems of oppression hurt all of us.
Exactly.
And when we have so that Keith Edwards,
right?
You are of like mind with him.
So this, and so in the work that you're doing, for example, Lou, how could we use this technology that you're creating to help us get past that, to get to that
technology
inclusionist level?
It can be a catalyst to conversation, but people have to solve these problems.
Right.
People have to solve these problems.
And isn't technology going to have to be tweaked constantly, no matter how you present it?
Oh, completely. It's going to help us, it's going to hurt us, it's going to influence us in ways that we can't even begin to understand. But people have to take ownership of these. And that's why individual efforts are important with system efforts in my mind.
Right. And that's kind of the whole point around everybody owning it, right? Because I think systems get us so far. But if we as individuals really, first of all, it's the awareness piece, right? It's the whole unconscious bias. I think until you are aware and you really kind of go through that learning, you really can't do much about, well, what should I act upon, right? Or what does that look like until you get the awareness piece. Then there's a whole skills building. And then it's you know, as individuals, it's going to lead to action, but everybody has to take some level of ownership. And there is different degrees of it depending upon the role that you have. But I think the biggest piece that I see is that it takes courage, right, to do that. And there's a level of fear to that as well.
Yeah.
And last week, you know, for MLK Day at my organization, I was asked to speak to MLK Day, and I'm thinking, what am I going to say? You know, a great man, did wonderful stuff, amazing stuff, started a momentum, and actually I just based it around, funnily enough, on our third, you know, strategic pillar around everyone owns inclusion, and the part of that was in today's society, and I think in the earlier talk, it was around just where we are as a world, as the world today, right? Everything that goes on, you know, Black Lives Matter and Islamism, so much stuff that's going on. So in some aspect, we've come a long, long way, but we also have a long way to go. And so what does that look like? So how can we stand, you know, on the shoulders of giants and continue that work? But it really is about you as an individual. And that's what's going to make the difference. You know, whether you're sitting in a meeting or you're introducing an initiative or you're part of HR, you've got the talent process. So what are those pieces you can really pick and really kind of get to?
Well,
I just want to quickly say here, before you take control again, is that we do want to take some questions. So we got about 10 minutes left here. So I don't know if we have a microphone or people are, anyway, just raise your hand and I will work you into it. Go ahead. I'll put you on the spot right now.
I can be very loud.
That way I can have
We
control.
can repeat it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess my biggest question is, I definitely understand diversity and inclusion and HR takes it at best. So I guess the area that I kind of see as really concerning is, I love walking into a room and seeing more people who look like me, or who look like those who don't look like me. I like seeing more women in the room, and ideally, diversity and inclusion means that if we hire diverse people and include diversity of thought in the room, then the folks who are building all of this technology will build diversity into those tools. But how do you see, for some of these companies that are tech-based companies, how do you see yourselves dealing with the historical context of that? So, you know, full transparency, I work for AWS, and we have a facial recognition system. And there's a lot of conversation about it being biased. And so, yes, we're hiring diverse engineers, but that doesn't take into account the 100 years of people of color being arrested for more crimes. And so, even though we're hiring diverse people to build these tools and this software, how do you contextualize the history in such a way that we're still building that diversity into these things that we've convinced ourselves are already diverse and inclusive, because technology is agnostic, but it's not, because people build the technology.
Right.
So how have your companies kind of been working on that? And if not, do you see a path to that?
Okay, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Who wants to take on that?
Well, I think you already kind of supported the argument I wanted to bring to this panel, which is, you know, there are one systems once it escapes the individual, it takes a life of its own, you know, and it takes a life of its own in technology. So solving for that issue is not going to be through putting all those engineers through unconscious bias training. It requires addressing each product and looking at the impact and the externality of that product in terms of the equity and exclusion consequences that it will have. And so that, and that has nothing to do with our interpersonal behavior. The other challenge that, made me think of what you're saying is that, the bias is not exclusive to the dominant group. We, who are in the underrepresented group, we have tons of internalized bias that we could easily, unbeknownst to ourselves, act out into a facial recognition system. Yeah. And so, and then, even present that system as being, inadvertently promote that facial recognition system as let's say, inclusive, just because we lend our name or presence, but in reality, no one has really tested that you know what I mean. Yeah. It hasn't really tested the consequences of what we created. And so that's the tricky part, yeah. And that's why I think we have to do these two things. What Shinder is proposing, in dealing with building the competency and the skills to be aware and deal with their own bias. That's very important. But we also have to understand that these creations that we made, whether it be software or will be even a building, has its own impact on equity and inclusion that needs to be examined, evaluated, and addressed.
Yeah. One thing I was going to add really quick was just around when you're releasing a product, really, it's very important to have a diverse team building that product. It's also very important to have a diverse team testing that product. Right. So in terms of, we can name countless examples of ways that, something has been released and it's like, oh, if you're left-handed, it didn't work. Or, there's a lot of different examples of that. And so I think just as important as who's building it is also who's testing it and how are you kind of running, running that new technology or new product or whatever it might be. How are you getting feedback on that and who's giving you that feedback?
And so one more point. And to that, so my previous employer, Microsoft, so if you go out and you do a search on inclusive design, there's a whole playbook of lessons learned around building products and facial recognition and also accents as well. Yeah. So, and that's a whole playbook around just the thought process around when you're building products. So they actually appeal to everybody on the planet. Yeah. And then the testing piece as well. So do a search and you'll see it's available now for everyone. And
something that we're doing at DocuSign, which I was not even really pushing for, but our design team actually created an inclusive design guild within our design team to really make sure that those conversations were happening and that they were educating themselves on what does inclusive design mean and what are some things that we need to be thinking about as a design team to make sure not just from an accessibility standpoint, but also just even beyond that from just inclusion overall.
I'm in the XRI group for XR inclusive design. Yeah. So I feel a personal responsibility not just to design accessible products, but also give access to creators with diverse voices, because that's going to be a huge part of this new technology. Yep.
Other questions out there? Anybody else? Two hands. Go ahead, way up there.
I think given the fact that there's so many people in this room that are in the discipline craft of HR, there'd be vigorous agreement that one of the first things that handles getting bias out of systems starts at hiring, right? Hiring diverse people. So my question is specific. What are you doing at Fortive and DocuSign and T-Mobile to increase, promote, support through technology or other means diversity referrals? The thing behind that being, as the lady was saying up front, people generally refer people that are like themselves. Right. And that is true with respect to, say, for instance, white men. Most programs that have been put in place that do these things, because of the way that they're structured, they wind up getting referral programs with a lot more white men. I'm curious to find out at Fortive, DocuSign, and T-Mobile what you guys are doing relative to.
I can take that. We just late last year launched a series of events we're calling blend events. So we're partnering with our hiring teams and our talent acquisition teams to not just tap into our own employee resource groups and do something that we call lunch and earns. It's a great way to tap into a diverse network and get some of those diverse referrals specifically. But the other thing we're doing is also we are creating very small, intimate, high-touch hiring events for certain roles. So we have a role that's we hire for all the time. It's called an MDR role, Market Development Representative. We're going out, our teams, recruiting teams are going out and inviting people to come to these very small and intimate events. It's very high touch. And we've seen incredible results from that in terms of inviting people to come in and just learn more about DocuSign in a different way. So it's about high touch. We've done it in Chicago, in Seattle, in San Francisco. So we piloted it last year with our MDR role. We're going to do it with a lot of other roles as well. Solution engineering, we'll be doing it with that role. We'll be doing it with our engineering roles. So I think tapping into some of those areas that you are, like groups that you already have, like our employee resource groups, our BOLD group and our Latinx group, they have huge networks of diverse talent. I was at Microsoft actually last week doing an event, and they had a really interesting suggestion as well, which I'll share here, is looking where is your diverse talent within your own organization, and is that a talent pool that you can then tap into and drive across your organization as well. So for Microsoft, they have a very, very diverse talent pool within their stores. Why can't you go in and tap into some of that diversity and bring them into other areas of the organization, not just from a professional development standpoint, but then you're also just feeding your own talent into other areas. So why can't you take them and then put them into a sales boot camp or something like that? So tapping into your current diverse employees is huge, and then you have to be intentional about who you're inviting to come in and learn more about what it's like to work at your organization.
Great. Let me quickly have you guys, because we're running out of time here.
Yeah, so one of the things we're doing is diverse slates. So for every director and above position, we have to have a diverse slate. So that's one of them. The ERGs, we're really looking to say, which organizations do you belong to? Which memberships do you have? Mm-hmm. So really tapping into those organizations you wouldn't normally think of, and really looking at which schools we go to hire, because, as we've discussed, you're going to go to hire from an alumni, right? And so then everybody ends up looking like you. But what I will also say is some of the schools, so you may get diversity, so and I'm not going to pick on Ivy League, but if you think of you're going to get diversity from those schools, but it's a different kind of diversity in the fact that, yes, you may come from different backgrounds, but what you see is you don't get the diversity of thought, because you're going to look at the problem the same way because you've grown up in the same system. So it's really looking at it broadly. And the last piece I'd say is remote working. We're really looking at that to say it broadens your network of people that you can have, because why do they have to come here to work? So they can be in any country. So immediately, but it is an education, unfortunately for some managers, because they're not always comfortable, right, with folks who are remote working. So those are a few things.
Okay, now to bring one more issue, I'll talk about an opportunity. So we have a great opportunity at T-Mobile, because we are the majority company, if you want to think about it that way, or where the underrepresented talent is the majority of the company. So at the base, we have a phenomenal pool of talent to pull through. So we're developing leadership programs. So, by the way, 50% of our employees are part of an ERG at T-Mobile. So through the ERG base, we're developing pilot leadership programs to grow that talent from within. That's one thing that we're doing. The other thing is we're looking at, without divulging too many secrets, when we look at the director level and above, we're trying a slightly different tactic, a little bit similar to what you described. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes brilliant minds think alike. But the other thing that we're trying there is, I'll describe in general terms, is we use a little bit of talent intelligence for that level, where we basically proactively mapping the talent that is available around the country, and reaching out to that talent.
You want to say anything quickly?
Well, I just think of inclusion. Diversity is great to get them in the door, but how are we going to include diversity of thought as we promote?
All right, please give a round of applause for our panel.
Thank you. Thank you.